Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome on behalf of Women Graduates USA. This is the first of several in a series that we are calling um, the New Paradigm. Certainly, we know that with everything that's going on here in our country, we certainly need to change how we think, how we work. And Geeta offered to start us off, and we are very grateful to her to do this. And I welcome all of you and looking forward to a really good session. Geeta?
Hi, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I'm happy to say that tonight we have Mexicans, Americans, and Canadians in our audience. And welcome to all of you. And I hope that this webinar will be useful to all of us. This webinar is titled Graduate Women in a New Global Economy, Leveraging Knowledge and Opportunity for Empowerment. This evening, we will be discussing three topics: tariffs in North America, careers in the new global economy, and the US-UN relationship. Now, this is an interactive webinar. So while I will go ahead and present on tariffs and careers, our first two topics, I hope that we can work together on our third topic, which is the US-UN relationship. We'll do an exercise. It'll be fun, I promise. Okay, so this 1 hour webinar is going to this is a 1 hour webinar. So I'm not sure with our very ambitious agenda whether we will have time for questions. But if you, and the exercise is important, I think. But if you will write down all the questions as they occur to you, if you put them in chat, we promise that we will send you responses as soon as possible. So I want to say right from the start of our time together that this is not a webinar that is driven by partisan politics. Instead, I'm hoping that we can develop an approach to grappling with the important issues of our time. However, having said that, I think it's fair to assume that we are all bewildered at the changes that are going on in America. Here at home, some people think that America is changing fundamentally as democracy and capitalism and liberties, personal liberties and freedom are questioned. All of these are key principles that have shaped the American identity for over 200 years. And as they are being questioned and new policies and ideas are being put into place, people are worried that the country is changing fundamentally. We have certainly seen an expansion of executive power. We have seen sweeping tax cuts for the rich and cuts in insurance for the medical health insurance for the medically indigent. We have seen mass federal firings. We have seen a fairly devastating deportation policy. We have seen scientific research and data purges. We have seen the mass firing of federal employees, and we have seen pressure brought on American institutions of higher learning so that they would curtail policies that would otherwise create diversity of people and thought on campus. We have also seen taxes levied on Canada and Mexico on the goods that they export to the United States. And we've seen a subsequent cooling of relationships between America and its neighbors to the north and south. And of course, last and probably not last, but certainly not least, there is the American withdrawal of um, commitments to global agreements as well as the financial aid obligations around the world. So there's little doubt that we are living in changed times, and we are all trying to understand the impact of these changes on ourselves, and particularly on the things that we stand for in this world. So there are a lot of policy changes to contend with. But as I said, we're going to deal with changes to the North American economy, to careers in the global economy, and to the American US, the American UN relationship. All of these issues are of great importance in the United States as well as around the world. Now, all of these topics are really huge and require a lot of discussion, but we are going to discuss them only to the extent possible given our time together. Now, not only are these changes, these policy changes, monumental in scope, they're also fairly significant in the manner in which they have been implemented. The current administration has issued executive actions, and by literally the flourish of a pen, has decided what fiscal policy will and will not achieve. So it is difficult to comprehend. It's more than our minds can contain, and we are overwhelmed. But when we become overwhelmed, we become disempowered. We feel like we want to give up. But at Women Graduates USA, we feel that individuals and civil society organizations have it in their power to create positive change. At Women Graduates USA, we also feel that a very good way of looking at these big issues is to apply the critical thinking lens, to apply a critical thinking framework to these issues. So we acquire knowledge, and within this knowledge lie opportunities for our actions and our advancement. So the critical thinking framework is fairly simple. Um, Thanks, Ronnie. I forgot to actually ask you to put that slide on. But the critical thinking framework is fairly simple. It asks 5 questions. The first question is, what are the actions that have been taken by the current administration, and what is the impact of these actions? Then the second question is, what were the motivations of the administration? Because it's important to think about the issues and the actions from all points of view, including points of view that we may not agree with. The third question is, what do we want? We want to be really sure of understanding the length and breadth of what we want. And unless we are clear on what we want, we're not going to find the appropriate opportunities for action. So after we ask that question, we naturally, I think, ask the question, what are the current efforts that are underway that might help with positive change? Is there anything going on? What's happening? And the last question is, how can we collaborate with these efforts? How can we participate in creating positive change? So tonight, as we apply this critical thinking framework, I'm going to ask for you to help me. So, as I said, what I think I will do is I will go ahead and apply this critical thinking framework to the first two issues to demonstrate what I mean. And then hopefully we can work together um, on the last issue, which is the US UN relationship. Okay, so the first policy change that we are discussing is to the North American economy. Now, of course, the North American economy is shaped by many social, economic, and environmental factors. It is also shaped by all of its treaties with the rest of the world. But what we want to concentrate on is tariffs in the North American economy, because this is a subject that has caused us pain and anxiety just in the recent past. But before we launch our critical thinking framework for the tariffs, I think we need to take a giant step back and widen our lens to gather more information. I think that first we have to understand that for decades now, America, Canada, and Mexico have been signatories to a treaty called USMCA, previously known as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Treaty. This treaty has for decades shaped trade flows and national economic strategic decisions in each of our three countries. Now, the ramifications of the USMCA have been and are vastly positive and vastly negative, depending on your point of view. But I will tell you that leading economists have said that this treaty is unfair and unbalanced. Now, this treaty has favored large corporations. It has allowed dumping in North America. It has increased pollution. It has devastated the livelihoods of several populations in each of our countries, including subsistence farmers in Mexico, and it has left small farmers in America and Canada in overwhelming debt and no control over pricing. This treaty has been responsible for the reduction of national policy spaces in each of our countries. And when national policy space is reduced, it invariably impacts the poorest people in each of our countries. Now, these examples that I've given you are just a few manifestations of this treaty. But you know, this treaty has been around for a long time, and it has provided a certain stable basis for each of our countries to make national economic decisions. And for us, the citizens of these three countries, we have just become accustomed to this treaty. We have become used to viewing our lives through the lens of this treaty. So let's just keep this information in our mind as we ask our first critical thinking question about tariffs. So, our first question is, what actions has the administration taken, and what are the impacts of these actions? Well, since the beginning of this year, the current administration has announced and levied tariffs on goods that Canada and Mexico export to the United States. However, we should also recognize at this point that the USMCA is alive and well, and that all of the goods that are exported by Canada and Mexico that are USMCA compliant are duty free. So, given this information, what exactly do we understand? We understand that 95% of Canadian goods that are exported to the United States and 84% of Mexican goods that are exported to the United States remain duty free. Of course, there is a 35% tariff on goods that are non US MCA compliant that Canada exports to the United States, and there is a 25% tariff on non-US MCA compliant goods that Mexico exports to the United States. So what does this mean? This means that tariffs are being levied on 5% and 16% of goods that are exported to the United States by Canada and Mexico, respectively. Obviously, it's not as straightforward as I'm making it sound. The percentages are higher depending on some industries like aluminum and steel, electric vehicles, and some agricultural goods. But here's the thing, tariffs, even on 5 and 16% of goods exported to the United States by Canada and Mexico, respectively, tariffs are damaging. Tariffs are responsible for the loss of thousands of jobs or the potential loss of thousands of jobs, and they expect the smallest manufacturers and the lowest wage workers to bear the immediate costs. So tariffs affect real people and real livelihoods. Now, let me give you an example. Artisans and entrepreneurs and small businesses that used platforms like Etsy to sell their goods have had to shut down. Why? Because they would have to pay between 40 and 50% of tax on low value imports, so that the low value imports that they usually use to create their own goods, they've had to shut down. Another example is the elimination of the de minimis threshold. Now, without the de minimis threshold, well, the de minimis threshold actually applies to the people who used to have sell on platforms like Etsy, but it also applies to people around the world sending American small packages, hopefully gifts that are delightful. But really now talking about Canada and Mexico, and people are not able to do that now because they would have to pay huge taxes, even on the smallest gifts. So that's tariffs. But what about the USMCA that is so all encompassing and is responsible for governing trade? 84% of the trade from Mexico and 95% of goods exported by Canada to the United States. My point is that in our anxiety about tariffs, we may have forgotten that the North American economy has for many decades been unfair and unequal. Because small businesses, you see, and local workers have, because of the MCA, been unable to participate in in the economies of all three countries. So what I'm thinking, our critical thinking framework is showing us that both tariffs and the USMCA are damaging to small businesses, to vulnerable workers. They favor large corporations. And they have tariffs, and the USMCA have an outsized impact on Canada and Mexico, and a slightly less, but still significant impact on the United States. So I'm hoping that the knowledge that we are acquiring through our critical thinking framework is showing us that our activism cannot just be limited to the reversal of tariffs, that we must try to get a better version of the USMCA. Because if we don't, and the USMCA continues in its current form, then the greater injustice in the economy of North America will continue. Okay, so let's hold all of that in our heads and ask the second question, which is, what was the administration's motivation? Now, fentanyl was given as the legal rationale and has certainly been a political rallying point as a reason for levying taxes. And also in the United States, we were told that tariffs were safeguarding the US worker. We were told that tariffs were helping the little guy against unfair trade practices. Now, obviously, none of that has stood up to closer scrutiny, which takes us to our next question, which is, what do we want? What do we want, really? And we need to be clear about this. Well, we want an economy in North America that is fair and equal to Canadians, Mexicans, and Americans. And we want an economy that is planet friendly. Our information shows us that we want the reversal of tariffs, but it also shows us that if we are to give momentum to an equal and fair economy in North America, we must also look for an alternative to USMCA. And so now our fourth question is, well, what are the efforts that are ongoing that may be moving us in some small way, large way, towards the kind of economy we want? And we know that in the United States, tariffs are going through the court systems. We know that a federal appeals judge has ruled that tariffs are beyond presidential authority. And we know that the case is now with the Supreme Court to be heard sometime in November. We also know that Congress is involved in passing tariff-related bills. And we also know that there is cross-border solidarity of Americans, Canadians, and Mexicans who are working to pressure Washington through high diplomatic channels. But we also know that there are other organizations that are working on this, on the reversal of tariffs and for the creation of a better USMCA. There are organizations like trade unions, like the AFL and CIO, the Canadian Labour Congress, and independent unions, Mexican unions, that are working on labor rights in the USMCA. We also have gender equality and racial justice groups. We have trade justice NGOs that are monitoring trade and equality. We have indigenous and racial justice groups that are trying to raise indigenous voices and marginalized voices in the case of tariffs, as well as making a case for a new USMCA. We have environmental and climate justice groups who are trying to connect fairness with sustainability. They're trying to show that fairness and sustainability don't have to be mutually exclusive. We have research networks that are putting together data for policy credibility. And of course, last but certainly not least, we have international organizations. We have the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and then we also have the International Labor Organization, and they're working at the international level to create better policies for free trade agreements across the world, but including North America. So, what are our opportunities? Is the last question we ask in our critical thinking framework for tariffs. Now, at first, we may think that we are not equipped to collaborate with any of these groups. Because, after all, as individuals and civil society organizations, we have been involved in fighting human, human rights violations. We have not been involved in shaping the overall economy of our respective countries, nor have we been involved in shaping the overall economy of North America. But I'm hoping that the critical thinking net framework is going to awaken in us a latent understanding that an unfair economy is responsible for some of the biggest human rights violations. In fact, if you think about it, some of the human rights violations that we have been working against all of our lives are manifestations of a grossly unfair economy. But the question remains that what can we do? So we can amplify and strengthen the work of these groups and NGOs and these networks. For instance, these NGOs working in trade justice have been asking for help in documenting the effect of tariffs on vulnerable workers, and then help in sharing these stories with the rest of the world, with the rest of America. We can also help in conducting research. Legal firms have been asking for help in doing the research that will go into the amicus briefs that will be filed with the Supreme Court. Now, we may not be used to this kind of work, but they are willing to guide us in the kind of research we should do and also how to format our research. Groups for justice are also looking for people who will track how USMCA commitments are being enforced, particularly when it comes to Mexican labor rights and also to how commitments are enforced when it comes to environmental protections at the borders of each country, because that is exactly where the dumping, the toxic dumping happens. Trade-focused organizations are asking for help with local economic data that they can use for their policy briefs and legal challenges. We can work with research organizations to develop viable policy alternatives that connect competitiveness, equity, and sustainability. And I think it's really important for us to work in coalitions that are working across borders, because coalitions that are working across borders are really taking the whole, the overview into consideration. And they're working for environmental protections, they're working for labor right protections, they're working for to rein in corporate excess and abuses, and most importantly, they're working to guard the national public policy spaces that have been reduced by the USMCA and made worse by the levying of tariffs. Now, I think it's really important to join a binational or a trinational coalition, because it's important to show that we are interested, each of us in each of our countries is interested in fair trade, not just in terms of our national interests, but that we are interested in fair trade in North America. And of course, we should also work with UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, because they will provide workshops that will teach us how to talk about inclusive trade and gender and trade, and how we can bring this information to our communities, how we can show people in our communities, point out to them, if they don't know already, the manifestations, the really unfair manifestations of the USMCA and tariffs. And they will also help us to launch a cross border public campaign that will coincide with their important days when they will be meeting with multilateral partners to talk about the global free trade agreements, including North American free trade agreements. So these are just a handful of opportunities that exist for us to work with bigger partners with more resources, partners who will teach us how to do the work if we are willing to do the work. And I'm hoping that you will see by now that the critical thinking framework is a really simple and elegant way of asking the questions that can build knowledge. And within that knowledge, we are able to see opportunities for action. So I'm hoping we can be inspired to reach beyond what we think is possible right now as individuals and civil society organizations. There's a lot to talk about in trade, but we're going to have to leave it at that because we have a limited amount of time together. What we're going to do now is I'm going to present to you how the critical thinking framework works with careers, looking at careers in a global economy. Now, I know that there are several people in our audience tonight who are graduating and are looking for careers. There are people in our audience who are thinking of switching careers. And if you are in the audience tonight and are not looking for a career and not looking to switch careers, then I know that you have family and friends who could use the information. So I'm hoping that this information will be useful for all of us. So let's ask our first critical thinking question about careers in the new global economy. The question is, what have been the actions of the current administration, and what are its impacts? Well, the current administration has issued a number of domestic executive actions and therefore policies that have impacted the American economy. But because America is so expansive, the effects of these actions and policies have rippled through the global economy. In other words, domestic executive actions do not remain within the shores of the United States. They impact the whole world. Well, what are the impacts of these executive actions? Well, these executive actions have reshaped global markets. They have reshaped industries and labor markets. They have reshaped investment priorities. They have reshaped or impacted trade, global supply chains, They have impacted um, research funding for higher education, talent flows into the country, and they have impacted environmental priorities in America and in the rest of the world. And all of this is now going towards shaping what is now being termed as the new global economy. And obviously, if we have a new global economy, we have careers that are being impacted by the global economy. So let's ask our second question, which is what was the motivation of the administration? The motivations in issuing these executive actions were to offer, they said, merit-based opportunities, to create a balance of trade for America, and to make America more globally competitive. But critics of these arguments say that when you try to offer merely merit-based opportunities, you're ignoring long-term systemic inequalities. When you try to boost growth at all costs, you're ignoring the long-term impacts of um, public health and environmental damage. And when you try at all costs to be competitive, then you are ignoring broader economic stability, and you're also ignoring international cooperation. So let's ask our third question. What do we want? Well, our heads are fairly spinning by now, and we hardly know what to think. But really, at a minimum, we would like to know, how do we look at this economy, and how do we look for careers? So let's ask our fourth question then, which is simply, what's happening? What is happening? And how do we take what is happening and help ourselves to seek careers, to identify long, resilient careers? So what is happening right now in the economy is that we are having to look at the economy in a whole different way. Before the executive actions, we were able to see the economy as divided into sectors. We had the manufacturing and industry, we had services, we had knowledge and information, we had extraction and natural resources, we had higher education, we had healthcare, etc., etc. Now, what has happened is this has been turned over on its head, this understanding, and we have a new way of creating sectors. Now we have 5 sectors. I was able to identify 5 sectors. You may be able to identify more. So the 5 sectors I identified, which are non-traditional, before executive action, these did not exist. The first sector is the susceptible or fragile sector because it is vulnerable to executive orders and regulations and approvals and crises. And in this sector, this fragile sector, we have companies that are highly dependent on government contracts and subsidies and approvals. And examples of this sector, companies in this sector, are retail and consumer goods, think Walmart and Target. We have higher education. We have healthcare and pharmaceuticals. And in some cases, we even have technology because there is some proposal in the White House that says that we are not going to sell advanced AI chips to 120 countries because we want to maintain leadership in AI. Now, what I want you to note about this sector is that it is made up of companies that are not, it's made up of industries that are not related to each other. In the old way of looking at sectors, we had, for instance, manufacturing. We knew that in the manufacturing sector, there were companies that were in a related industry. Now we have sectors that have disparate industries, not at all related to each other. We have consumer goods and we have higher education in the same sector and healthcare. And this is because this sector is now defined, our new sectors are defined by whether they are impacted by executive orders or whether they're insulated from executive orders. So, in our new sector system, the second sector that I was able to identify was the sector that is fairly insulated from executive actions. So, for instance, these are companies that are driven by consumer demand and market trends and are fairly immune to policy changes. And these are all consumer-driven companies. Examples are e-commerce and online retail, um, beauty and personal care, hospitality, fashion. So these companies are fairly safe and they're growing quite rapidly. Now we have sectors that are adjacent to this sector that is immune or fairly insulated from executive actions. And in the adjacent sector, we also have companies that are growing. And in this sector, we have companies like advertising and creative agencies. We have travel and booking platforms. We have fitness equipment manufacturing. We have food and beverage. Now, the fourth sector that I was able to identify was a hybrid sector. Now, in this sector, we have companies that are driven by consumer demand, but still require the goodwill, the political goodwill of the current administration. And companies, and you'll recognize this immediately, these are companies that are largely driven by consumer trends and market trends, but still require the blessing of the current administration. And recently we saw an example of that, a company like Disney that under pressure had to suspend a late night host and then because of consumer demand had to take the whole thing back. Now these are companies that are really caught between a rock and a hard place. And in this sector, we also have big tech like Apple and Meta and Google all require political goodwill. And we also have some media conglomerates. So the last sector that I identified in our new way of thinking is the adaptive sector, which I think of as the sector that is companies in this sector are growing not in spite of executive action, but because of executive action. So companies that represent this sector maybe companies that are in homeland security, in cybersecurity and surveillance. They might be in compliance. They might be companies that are now responsible for reshoring global supply chains, the new logistics. These are companies that are going to be highly in demand because executive actions have broadened their scope. So our fourth question then is how do we look for a career in this most our fifth question really is how do we look for careers in this sort of mosaic of executive actions and careers and just a whole totally changed landscape. And this is what our people, our members of the audience are looking for, is some way of making sense of all of this. And I would say that it's a lot to deal with, but career seekers have to do their homework. First of all, you have to look at your career aspirations within the framework of the characteristics of the new sectors. If your career is in a sector that is fragile or susceptible to executive actions, you should not be discouraged, because the American economy is still deeply integrated with the global economy, and the global economy is still pretty much a rules-based system. So if the company that you're thinking of is operating under a free trade agreement, it's probably immune to executive action, and it's probably not going to have to pay tariffs. This is the same thing that we discussed a little bit earlier when we talked about the USMCA compliant companies who were exporting goods from Canada and Mexico to the United States and did not, therefore, because they were under the USMCA, did not have to pay tariffs. So, in that respect, I think that you can have a good career in a company like that. On a related but separate note, I would say think globally. Because while global thinking does expose your company to the risk of trade restrictions and geopolitical tensions and overseas US taxes, the risk is diversified, because global demand can continue even if US demand softens. And also, companies that are serving global demand can hedge their currency and investment risks to avoid market volatility. So, those are places in which you can have a resilient career. Additionally, I would say don't forget to think about when you're looking for a career, please consider the United Nations Sustainable Development Program, because while it's also called the SDGs, it's the biggest human development program in the world. And while the American federal government has withdrawn its commitment to the SDGs are actively creating careers in the United States and abroad. And why is that? Because corporations are still using SDG frameworks for their sustainability and ESG initiatives. And they are hiring for jobs and really careers in sustainability and policy analysis and monitoring and evaluation of their sustainability progress. And also, NGOs and foundations and even universities are still are still creating programs and research projects and even degree tracks that are aligned with SDG priorities like climate action and social equity. And also, in the cities and states of the United States, we still have governments that are using SDG frameworks for urban planning, for renewable energy, for public health, for community development, and jobs are being created in government at the city and state level. And finally, don't forget that if you are interested in a company that has US-based offices, that company will still hire for roles, for jobs and careers that are SDG linked. And that can be a very resilient career also. So that's what I wanted to say to you about the sectors. But I also wanted to remind you to look at American and global consumer trends. We've just looked at examples of how consumer trends are so powerful that they can actually be insulated from executive actions. So consumer trends are literally the first signals of where skills and jobs are either emerging or fading. And examples of consumer trends are, health and wellness, sustainability, and ethically sourced products. We have anything that is convenience based, like companies that are producing smart devices or are providing immersive experiences. So, consumer trends are really important to look at. And as we look at consumer trends, we should also not forget to look at market trends. Now, market trends are a little bit different. They're going to show you where companies are making investments. And where companies are making investments, there will be jobs and careers. And examples of company investment are AI and 5G and cloud computing, and those are places that are certainly creating careers and jobs. Now, when we're talking about trends, we should also remember to think about business trends. Business trends are different from market and consumer trends because business trends really show you how businesses are operating, how they're structured, how they're innovating. And these are plans, business plans that are creating careers and jobs. So, an example of a business trend would be digital transformation and automation, also agile operations, also looking at remote and hybrid work models. So, these are the trends you should be looking for. And 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 if you can't find a job in your primary sector, don't be discouraged. Look in an adjacent sector, because chances are that your skills are transferable, because primary and adjacent sectors have the same common market drivers, technologies, and regulatory frameworks, and it's highly likely that you'd be able to transfer all your skills from the primary sector to the adjacent sector. And then I also think that common sense tells us that we should keep up with upskilling. You always want to be market relevant. So look at what your career aspirations are, look at what your skills are, upskill to stay relevant, take courses online, get the certifications. And of course, if you're working, don't forget to get really meaningful on the job training. And and then last of all, I would say, don't forget to look in that new sector, which is the adaptive sector, where companies are growing not in spite of executive actions, but because of executive actions. So that, unfortunately, it's a very big topic, careers in the new global economy, but that's just the time we have right now. But I will leave you with this idea that WGUSA does from time to time offer career advancement and professional development training. And if you're interested in a longer discussion of what we have just covered, or you are interested in a training, please do get in touch with WGUSA. So that brings us then to the exercise that we're going to do that I warned you about at the top of the hour. And I'm hoping that you will think it's fun. Um, we will just take a few minutes now. Maybe you can unmute your mics. I see that all of you have your videos on, which is good. And we will apply the critical thinking framework to the US UN relationship. And just to keep the topic manageable, we will talk only about the US funding for the UN's core budget. We will not talk about funding to peacekeeping, and we will not be talking about the United States voluntary donations to the UN. So let me ask you the first question, and I'm hoping that you'll raise your hand, and I'm hoping that Ronnie will help me recognize that you've raised your hand. The first question is, what are the actions that the current administration has taken um, uh, uh, in its relationship to the UN, particularly its funding for the UN's core budget? Anyone at all hazarding guesses? Ronnie, can you see any raised
I
hands?
don't see any raised hands at the moment.
Oh, you guys. Okay.
Okay.
Yes, you
Yeah,
raised it.
sorry, can you rephrase that question, Geeta? I'm not sure I quite understood what you were
So,
asking.
what is what is your understanding of the actions that the current administration has taken with regard to its to American funding for the UN's budget?
You're not talking about USAID.
We're talking about USA contributing.
USAID.
No, we're not talking about USAID because that's a State Department program. We're just talking about the UN core budget. You know, the UN does a lot around the world, the big humanitarian programs. So, what has happened with that funding? Every country gets assessed for its share of contribution to the UN's core budget. And what do you think we've done most recently about this funding? What announcements have you heard? Have you heard? Okay.
So I have Carrie's hand up as well.
Okay, just I can't see without my
Oh,
glasses. So, Ronnie, you'll have to tell me.
all right, so
Whoever,
Carrie and then Mariella. Carrie,
okay,
I need to, oh, there you go.
My first comment is, and it probably affects everything that's going on for the United States at the UN, is our representation. The individuals that are chosen to represent the United States at the United Nations are not informed or advocacy oriented, nor connected with the general American population's interest in what is being done on behalf of them at the United Nations. And when you have an individual or any individual that's being assigned by this current administration appears to have this profile, they're not likely to be involved in any conversations of substance. The sidebar.
okay. All of that is true. All of that is absolutely on target. But my question is, what have they done about the funding that they owe, the money that they owe towards the UN budget? Someone else.
Mariella, Faye.
Okay, so I can talk, Geeta. Um, I would just say that the administration here does not really, it's an America First agenda. And they're not interested in, first of all, the US historically provided the most financial support to the UN. So this administration feels that that's unjust somehow, and they're always calling for other countries to step up what they do. And I think that they have, some of them have to some degree, but I just feel like the basic message here is they're not going to support, just like USAID, things like this, they're not supporting these global issues. It's a
Right.
first.
Okay. Absolutely. And does anyone have any more detail about
Tessa?
exactly?
Yeah, they have withdrawn a ton of funding as far as their like forecast for funding, as well as didn't they recently just decline to pay the second half of their funding for peacekeeping and like what they committed previously?
Yes.
Yes,
They
yes.
did this before too.
Well, here's the thing. There have always been arrears in the United States funding the money that it was assessed for by the UN, and these arrears have occurred. To stick to the facts, these arrears have occurred under administrations of both parties. But to be fair, most presidents have tried to clear up the arrears. Now, of course, there are arrears from the first term of this current administration that have not been completely cleared up. And now the current administration is going to cut 500 million from the 834 million that it owes to the UN's core budget. Now, that may seem like a small amount, but we're talking about something very specific. We're not talking about contributions that they owe towards UN peacekeeping, which is in the billions. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about voluntary contributions in the millions and billions. We're not talking about that. So they have reduced the contribution. They haven't actually reduced. They have announced that they will reduce, and this money would be reduced for the 2026 UN budget. So the impact of the UN reduction is going to be about, on the UN, is to reduce about 20% of its staff positions. But to be fair, the UN has also been restructuring for a number of years. But this 20% is going to now create major disruptions in humanitarian programs around the world. Why am I trying to be really clear about this? Is because critical thinking really asks us to do our research and to stick to the facts. If there were arrears under other administrations that we favored, then we must say that there were arrears. There were arrears under Obama's and Biden's administration, and I happen to love both of them. But so the reason we have to be clear about our research and what we are saying is because we cannot build knowledge unless we stick to the facts and not repeat the things that we may have heard in our comfort zones. My comfort zone is MSNBC, so. But okay, so and so this is going to result in a 20% reduction in staff. And what do you think the motivations of the current administration were? Anyone at all?
So Dolores has her hand up.
Dolores?
I just wanted to say that as of this last April, the U.S. was owed the UN $1.5 billion, and funding to the UN by the U.S. has been frozen. So nothing is being paid as of today, and that was the latest figures. So
right. We're talking about the 2026 budget, but you're absolutely right. No, the arrears have been frozen. So you're right. You're absolutely right. Well, what do you think the motivations were? Because that's important. Okay, so
keep the money at home.
Yeah, and I think that it was very sort of artfully stated that the US is trying to create a different foreign policy profile for itself, and that it is no longer going to be funding international organizations that are misaligned with its foreign policy objectives and its fiscal objectives. So the reason this is important to understand is because sometimes you can make a case against it and sometimes you can't. And in this case, we really don't know what the fiscal objectives are. We don't know what the foreign policy objectives are. It's rather abstract. There's no way for us to respond to that. So now we're going to move on to our
Geeta, Sally has her hand up.
Sorry, Sally.
Okay. I just would like to know, based on not having people giving us, you said get your facts straight. Where can we trust that we get the right facts at this point in time? Because a lot of the data is not even going to be collected going forward. So where do we know that the data that we're reading is the facts?
Well, that's an important question, but right now we can get research from reliable research sources. We have universities and we have other institutions, research institutions that are producing data. So we can, I don't know in the future um, how this is going to transform. But right now, I think that we can be reliable. And then we always cross reference our information. We don't rely on just one source. If a few sources say something, then I think that we have to put our sort of tentative faith in that. So, okay, so what do we want from this now? I mean, we want a lot at this point, but what do we want in terms of we know the funding is reduced, the staff is going to be reduced. So what do we want right now other than increasing the funding?
I'd say we want UN women protected.
Yes, we do. So basically, what we are saying is that we want the agencies that are pivotal to gender equity, all of their agencies are pivotal to some kind of security and equity. But as women, we want UN women protected. But we also want the UN, I think, to be able to achieve its sustainable development goals, because the intention of these goals is everything that we want. The intentions of these goals, sustainable development goals, are to balance economic development, social inclusion, and environmental protection. And all of those things we want, because we can't have a fair and equal, equitable, equal economy without those things. So, can we move on to what efforts do you think are underway right now? What have you heard? What are the efforts in the United States as well as around the world that are trying to help the UN carry on its work? Anyone at all? Okay, so I realize it's getting late. So I'm going to just say that obviously, legislatively, Congress is trying to get back its power of the purse, and there are lawsuits that are pending, and there's always the barrage of advocacy letters to our elected officials. But other than that, substantively, there are not-for-profits that are trying to build capacity into the work of the UN so that the work of the UN will be extended in scope and they will be able to achieve their outcomes. Now, these not-for-profits have been working for a couple of decades with the UN because the needs of the world have always outstripped the UN's financial ability to perform, to provide services. So if these not-for-profits are doing this, what are the opportunities for us? Can anyone think about that? Okay, so if you look at the facts, you see that there is opportunity always to amplify the work of these organizations. Women's organizations like ours can build capacity into UN programs around the world. Now, it will take some organizing on our parts. We have to inventory our resources. We have to figure out what we are bringing to the table to this capacity building. And if we are individuals, we will have to join organizations that are building capacity or are gearing up to build capacity. We will have to obviously understand exactly what it is that we have to do. We could go the extra mile by doing the research in various countries of the needs of UN programs that are currently underway and are understaffed. And we can also be trained by UN staff. Yes, that is happening. Training by UN staff, various agencies of the UN, to to help us understand the needs of the recipient populations in countries around the world, and also for us to understand the culture of these recipient populations. And of course, they will train us in the protocols that we must follow so that our work is aligned with the philosophy of UN service provision. So there are a number of steps that we could take. And if we can get organized and we can be facilitated, aided by information and communications technologies, then we are going to be able to provide capacity. And capacity is required in the following programs around the world: in educational services, in healthcare awareness, in leadership development, development of volunteers who have volunteered on the ground in recipient populations who have stepped up to the plate and want to be leaders. We can also help the UN with project management and evaluation, the empowerment of women, and we can also help with support of women as they become employed and mentoring. We can do research and policy support for UN agencies. And I think one of the best things that we can do is to link grassroots activists from recipient populations with advocacy platforms in the United States, bringing the voices of these activists directly to policymakers and donors. And of course, a really, I think, interesting and perhaps even fun but serious thing would be to collaborate with the agencies, the agencies in the United Nations agencies programs that are already underway, and there are women's groups already helping United Nations agencies with projects. So helping them, collaborating with the projects on the ground would be very nice.
So,
Yeah,
Geeta, you're what you're going here. I can't raise my hand because I'm the host, but one thing I heard you say a lot during today was how we can amplify things. And I'm sitting here thinking about what you're saying, and I think about, especially with the UN, how sometimes complex it seems, and what really are these goals, and what's really happening. And I keep thinking that we as WGUSA could also have a voice, a role in amplifying and helping people to understand so more women can see the possibility of them doing the kinds of things you are just saying. So in addition to doing that, I probably know people, as I think about it, that might find getting involved in that kind of work interesting, and amplifying that and spreading the word that of what it really means seems to be another way to really help turn the tide.
I think that you have hit upon a point that is really important, because amplifying does not just mean working on a project. Amplifying means increasing the visibility of the UN and its work, increasing the influence of the UN in our local, talking about the influence that the UN has and what it's doing, talking about it to our communities. So amplifying is really important. Strengthening programs is also important. And the reason I may seem like I'm rushing is because we have gone over our 1 hour mark, and I do want to complete this discussion. We have sort of answered all of the 5 questions, the critical thinking framework. I hope that you will think about it some more. But these are just a few opportunities that I have been able to come up with for our engagement for building capacity into the UN. So while this is bringing us to the end of our webinar, I just want to quickly recap what the thrust of this webinar really was, which is to apply critical thinking to the major issues of our time. And there are many. And so we talked about the critical thinking framework. There were the 5 questions. What are the actions of the current administration? What are the impacts? What were the motivations? What do we want? What are the efforts that are underway already looking for opportunities? And also, how can we participate in some of this work? So this kind and this kind of opportunity that critical thinking yields is called practical activism, because practical activism is the activism that is grounded in performance, it's grounded in outcomes, and it is and we are able to evaluate it, monitor it, and evaluate it. Now, this activism is different, perhaps, from the activism that we have been used to. We do a lot of writing of letters to our congressmen and our senators, and that is very important, really important to always let our elected officials know where we stand, really important to keep up the pressure, and that is a practice we must not let go of. But we can also think about pragmatic activism. So on that note, I will end this webinar. I think all that remains now is for me to say thank you for attending. I'm really grateful for your time. And also to say, please stay in touch with us so that we can grow together and we can exchange ideas. And, thank you for all the work that you may be doing already. And I hope that you will look after yourselves in these dramatically changed times. So thank you and good night.
And thank